Hello and welcome to another KStevMath video. This is for my Pre-Algebra series, Lesson 2 on subtracting negative numbers. So last lesson we did adding negative numbers. This lesson we're going to see what's different if we want to subtract them instead of add them. Now if you are going to take notes or would like to take notes, I have a notes page that you can go get off my website, KStevMath.com, link in the description. And that will help you save some time so you don't have to write down every single problem. You can just concentrate on working out the examples with me instead of having to pause and write and then start up the video again. So head over there if you're interested. It's completely free if you want to go and grab it. And let's get started with subtracting negative numbers. But first, actually, let's review what we learned last time, which is adding negative numbers. And just a quick reminder, negative numbers help us represent opposites. So you can think of it as debt versus income. You could think of it as like opposing teams or opposing forces that are counteracting each other, different directions on a number line. But whenever we're talking about a positive 5 versus a negative 5, they're both 5, just we're trying to say that they're different 5s. They're 5s that oppose each other. So kind of a weird concept, but just a reminder that that's what's going on. So as we remember, how do I add positives and negatives together, we need to think about the fact that they're opposites and they're going to counteract each other. So this warm-up that I have here is adding positives and negatives, and so if you did the last lesson with me and did homework and things like that, then hopefully you know exactly how to do these problems. That being said, I'm going to walk you through them to remind you kind of our thought process that we should go through. And the reason we're doing this is because our lesson today, subtracting negative numbers, is very, very much tied into the rules we use for adding positives and negatives. So it's going to be helpful to make sure that we're all on the same page with how adding works, so that when we add subtraction into the mix, we have a good foundation to start from. So if you would like to pause the video and try these yourself, feel free to do that. And then you can either watch my explanation or skip ahead to see if you got the right answers, whichever one. So this is a case where we're adding. So with adding negative numbers, we have kind of two rules we follow. One is if they're the same sign, you just add the numbers and keep whatever sign you have. And then the other rule has to do with if they're different signs. If they're different signs, you subtract the two numbers, and then your answer is the sign of the bigger number from the problem. So here on A, we have -4 plus a -5. Since those are both negatives, it's like we have debt that we are adding more debt to, and so it's going to make us have more debt, which is not is a very negative idea to think about being in more debt. So get it, negative, because we're talking about negatives. Okay, anyway, so -4 plus -5 would make a more negative number. So our answer is 4 plus 5 is 9, but we keep the negative sign, so our answer is -9. Okay, let's look over here on the top right at B. A positive 9 plus a -15. Now here our signs are different, so we subtract our numbers. We say, well, what is 15 minus 9? And so we actually switched around the signs right for that. We said, okay, I need to take the bigger number and subtract the smaller number. 15 minus 9 is 6. But because the 15 is the bigger number there and is negative, our answer is a -6. So this would be a case where maybe we have 9 of something and we're adding to that the idea of taking away 15. And so that's we don't have enough to actually cover that, right? So we're going to go into debt to try to give the 15 to whoever needs 15 of whatever it is they need. Let's look at the bottom left here at C. We've got +6 plus -2. So again, we have different signs, so we're going to subtract. 6 minus 2 gives us 4, and it's a positive 4 because the 6 there is the bigger number and is positive. So 4 is our answer. And then this final one is just like the good old days when we used to add and not even know about negative numbers, because there's no negatives in that problem. So +8 plus a +21, you add and you keep the positive sign. So 8 plus 21, if you don't already try to add things in your head, you might think about doing that. Yes, I can write this down and add it, but it could be that if you put forth a little bit extra mental energy, you might start finding that you can do things like that in your head if you haven't already tried it before. I really like doing math in my head. I think it's a lot of fun. You can really freak people out by doing math in your head that they don't expect you to be able to do in their head, just as a side note. So this warm-up was for us to make sure we understand how to add positives and negatives. So we're now going to think about what's different when we subtract than when we add. So let me put forth an idea for you here that you probably have not thought about before, because you haven't had the tools to think about them until now, where we have negative numbers that we're talking about. Subtraction does not actually have to exist once we know about negative numbers, and that is because we can always change subtraction into the idea of adding a negative. If we think back to C that we just did, where we had a plus 6 and then plus -2, and we just did 6 minus 2 and got 4. Did you think about that at all, that that's the same question as 6 minus 2 without all those extra signs? So you can see here what I mean, hopefully, by this idea that we don't actually have to write things, with subtraction. Now, you could, if you're wanting to, like be like, yeah, but in that case, we also don't really need addition. We could write everything as subtraction. That is true, and that's a good point. So we decide which way we want to think about it, right? You could, I suppose, go through your life thinking about everything being subtraction. But the issue with that is that we tend to make more mistakes whenever we have more negatives versus having more positives. And so that's why I'd like to encourage you to, let's just pretend like subtraction is not a thing, unless it is just something we know right away. Oh, I know how to subtract that. Sorry. So if it comes to a problem that has a lot of negatives, for instance, and it's asking you to subtract, we're just going to pretend like it's not really subtraction, it's addition. And here's how we do that. So I have this problem here, 5 minus 3. Now, I'm not saying that in this case it's easier to do this as addition than subtraction, because you probably already know what 5 minus 3 is without having to do anything. But here's why we don't actually need to think about this as subtraction. We can think about this as 5 plus a -3, and based on our addition rules for positive and negatives, we're actually going to do the same thing, the exact same thing we would do if we just left it alone and did 5 minus 3. Now, that's not super helpful here, because we know what 5 minus 3 is, and it's quicker just to think 5 minus 3 is 2. But how about this -10 minus 18? What do you think the answer should be to that? Like, I want you to actually think about that and guess. What do you think you do with -10 minus 18? What makes sense about this? Are we saying, okay, I'm going to take -10, and that means I'm in debt, maybe. I'm in debt 10, and now I'm going to subtract 18 from my balance. So does that make me be more in debt, or does that make me be less in debt? And think about, how are you going to make that connection there of what do I do because I'm subtracting here instead of adding? And what should actually happen, whether you realize it or not, is you should be thinking of the rule that we learned from last time, which is that we want to really think of this as a debt of 10 that we're adding to that more debt of 18. So it's the same idea. And really it's up to you which way you want to think about it. It may be that you are really you may be able to think, okay, I get it. -10 minus 18 makes it more negative, so my answer is -28. But it may be that your brain needs you to spend the time thinking about it as addition instead, so that you just don't get overwhelmed by rules. So what you need to do is find a way to internalize these rules so that 3 weeks from now, a month from now, 3 years from now, whenever you're doing problems like this, you know what the answer is without having to really think about it. Just like how you don't have to think as hard about counting as you once did, you don't have to think as hard about 2 plus 2 as you once did. You want to internalize these rules so that they make sense. But there's this idea that I want to get across here, that if you see subtraction and you don't know what to do with it, change it to addition and see if that helps. And so the way we do that is by putting a plus and moving the negative over. There's another thing though that's going to happen to us that I didn't write this down. What if we're trying to subtract a negative number? Then what? How does that work? And so what that's going to do is actually put positives and negatives, like multiple ones next to each other. Here's what I mean. If this instead was negative 10 minus negative 18, like this, those two negatives together interact. So there's a parentheses in between them. I'm talking about these two negatives in front of 18. Let me point those out. These two negatives right here. Those interact, and they interact in kind of a neat way, that these two negatives together actually make a positive. Because if you think about this as being opposites, right? The first negative saying, okay, do the opposite. The next negative is saying, do the opposite of that. So all of a sudden we're back where we started. If we think about double negatives in English, for instance, if you say, I never need no math, which is just a horrible sentence, right? I never need no math. We have never is negating. We have no that's negating. Well, if I never need no math, doesn't that mean I actually am saying that I always do need math? So it's the same idea that you've got these two negatives in a row. Two negatives are going to make a positive. So we could think about this instead as saying negative 10 plus 18. There are some tricks that I've heard kids use before that their teachers have taught them. One of them is like by just saying like plus plus or change. When you see these two negatives next to each other, you change, and you actually can just write on top of them and make them look like plus signs instead. So anytime two negatives are together, they can cancel each other out like that and become pluses. That's different, by the way, just to be clear here, that's different than the fact that this has two negatives. We're talking about two negatives that are right next to each other. When I subtract a negative, what I'm really doing is adding, because we have opposite, so we're actually adding them together. Okay, so if you're feeling confused, hopefully we'll be able to make this all work out. I've got one more slide to talk about positives and negatives, and then we'll do a bunch of examples. So here's a thing where if you are writing down notes and keeping notes, this might be something that you look back on later to help you remember. So the way positives and negatives interact when they're right next to each other, not a number in between them, but right next to each other, is if for whatever reason, if you have a plus and a plus next to each other, we could shorten that by just writing plus. So a positive and a positive are together a positive. So this is a situation where if you're saying, I'm going to add to my fruit bowl 5 apples, okay, so a positive, because I'm adding to it, I have a positive number of apples, right? It makes sense that that should still be a plus. Then to the right, a plus negative, that is going to actually end up being subtraction. And so we can go either way with this. Maybe we see a subtraction sign and we're going to actually just change it to plus and negative because it's easier to think of it that way. Or maybe it's easier to say take that plus negative and change it to a minus sign. We can go either way there. Then the next one, bottom left, minus, this is what we just talked about on the previous slide. Two negatives make a positive. This is true in math and English, but not in real life. So in real life, if you do two things that are negative, you're probably in extra deep trouble. But in math here, if we have two negatives next to each other, if I'm subtracting my debt, right? If I subtract my debt, I really gain something out of that, right? So negative and negative is a plus. And then bottom right, minus plus is also going to end up being a minus. So if I'm subtracting a positive, well, that's what we're used to with subtraction. Subtracting a positive number is just subtraction in general. So we're going to do some examples here, and I encourage you to really think about why you think the answer is what it is, and then test that theory out on the next problem, and then use that to figure out if you know what you're doing or not. Okay, so practice is going to be super important here, as it always is in math. So our instructions here say change to an addition problem, then solve. And I do want to encourage you to solve it to an addition, or change it to an addition problem, just because that's probably going to make it easier than if we leave it alone. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that what's in the middle here, which is a minus right now, is going to be a plus. But what that does is that also changes what's next to it, just like what we have in our previous the previous thing that I talked about, the plus minus and what that is, and minus plus and what that is. So this is saying positive 11 minus positive 17. So we're instead going to think of that as positive 11 plus a negative 17. And again, maybe that's not the way that makes the most sense to you. If you've got a different way of doing it that makes sense to you, and you are consistently getting the right answer, then go with that. Because that's good. That's how we learn math, is by like forming a hypothesis, testing it, and seeing if what we're doing is right. So what I've chosen to do, though, is change this to addition. That now I'm doing 11 plus a negative 17. They're different signs, so I subtract them, figure out, hey, what is 17 minus 11? And I get 6, but because 17 was the bigger number, this should be negative 6. Okay, looking down at B, negative 7 minus negative 2. So if you want to do plus plus or change, if you want to think those words in your head, we can actually do this. If I change this to plus, it's going to change this to plus as well. So plus plus. So negative 7 plus 2, those are different signs, so we're going to subtract. 7 minus 2 is 5, and the bigger number is a negative 7, so our answer is negative 5. Going back to that idea of opposites, I have negative 7, and I am adding to that 2, so I'm making it less negative, which is how I'm going to end up with negative 5. Let's look at the top left at C. So I'm going to change this so that the negative in the middle is plus, but that makes the 9 turn into a negative. So it's just that we're like shifting this negative over and swapping the signs as we do that. So negative 1 plus negative 9, I'm adding two negative numbers together, so that means they become more negative. I add them together and get negative 10. And then this negative situation down here, again, we can plus plus, and now this is just an addition problem. 9 plus 35. We might need to write this out, although again, I encourage you to think about trying to do some of this in your head if you haven't already. When I do this in my head, I think, okay, how much does it take to get from 35 to 40? It takes 5. That means I have 4 left of 9 that I need to add. So 5 of the 9 is going to get to 40. I have 4 more, and that takes me to 44. Now it's the same idea that you're doing whenever you write it down in carry. It's just how I think about it in my head and how you might be able to think about it in your head if you are interested in that. So our answer here is positive 44. I've got another set of examples that's the same style problem, not any trickier, but just we need to at some point say, okay, do I understand this? So I've got example 2 and I've got a now you try. And so somewhere along the way here, you should be pausing the video and trying it ahead of time and then seeing if you're right. And if you're not, then talk to a parent, sibling, friend who has gone through this before or is going through it now, and see if you can figure out what it is you're doing wrong and correct it. Or you can also leave a comment for me with your question, and I can do my best to help you with it in that way as well. So let's look at example 2. So example 2 has the same instructions. Change to an addition problem, then solve. So again, pause the video if you feel like you've got the hang of this, and then start it back up when you're done or stuck. Negative 5 minus negative 9. This is two negatives next to each other is going to make a plus plus. So we've now written it as addition, and now we need to think negative 5 plus 9. Those are different signs, so I'm going to subtract them. Another tip, by the way, is that you also can, once you change this to addition, you can switch these around, so that if, once this is a plus 9, if you would rather think about this as 9 plus negative 5, I just naturally kind of do that in my head, but if you want to rewrite it and turn it around, you can do that, but you have to do that after you've changed it to addition, or you might accidentally transfer the signs incorrectly, which would lead to a wrong answer. But the advantage to thinking of it this way is that then we could actually turn it back into subtraction, because that's really what we're doing, right? When we have different signs, 9 and -5, we're going to subtract them and get 4, and it's a +4 because 9 was bigger. So those are the kind of things where the better our understanding of how this is working, the more that we're thinking in our head about this, we can really we can understand it and not necessarily have to use these pesky longer like rules of, okay, I gotta change it to addition. Okay, I gotta think about the poem and sing the Row 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 Your Boat song. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and look at the previous video. So let's look at B. 15 minus a +21. So we could try to do this as subtraction and think about, okay, if I have +15 and I subtract a +21, what do I get? Or we can go ahead and change it to addition. So that makes it plus and then minus. And then since they're different signs, we subtract and we keep the sign of the bigger number. So 21 minus 15, which I have to borrow and I get 6. But it's a -6 because the 21 was the bigger number and was negative. Let's look up here at C. So here we've got two negatives next to each other, so this is going to be a plus plus. Plus 11 plus 2 is plus 13. And then the last one on this example, -10 minus a +64. So this is where we can say -10 plus -64. Just moving that negative over so that now we have an addition problem. -10 plus -64 is -74. And so that would be our answer right there. So next I've got a now you try. So if you have not already tried some on your own, this is the time to do it, to see if you understand what's going on. Now you try. So pause the video, write these down if you need to, and then work them out, and then start up the video to see if you've got the right answer. So I'll wait. You're back! Awesome! Okay, so we're going to change to an addition problem, then solve. So -16 plus -8 equals, those are the same sign, so I'm going to add them and keep the sign. 16 plus 8, you might need to come over here and do to the side, or like I said, you can try to do this in your head. We get 24, but since these were both negative, it's going to be a -24. Let's look at the bottom left here, B. +17, oh, minus minus means we're going to plus plus. So +14 plus 72 is, let's see, 6, nothing to carry, and 8. Both of these are positive, so that makes a +86. C, another plus plus situation, plus, plus, -35 plus 12. They have different signs, so let's subtract and get 23, but since the 35 was bigger, that makes this a -23. And finally, +3 minus +9. So another way of saying that is +3 plus -9. And so since the signs are different, I'm going to subtract and keep the sign of the bigger number. So 9 minus 3 is 6, but the -9 is bigger, so it's a -6. Just as a real quick side note, I find it really easy to change negatives into pluses by just writing over them. Hopefully you do too. Doing the opposite, changing a plus to a negative by writing over it, does not really work. If you're really wanting to not have to rewrite on a problem like D, and so you decide to do plus, my best suggestion is to actually mark out the plus sign and put like a minus sign. You got one of the easiest things to do in math from now on in your life is going to be dropping negatives on accident or things like that, messing up your positives and negatives. So the clearer you can be in your writing, the better. Because if it's hard to tell that there is a negative there, it makes it all the more likely that you will accidentally not put the negative there and then get it wrong, and how sad would that be? Depends on what it is you're doing, I suppose. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment if you'd like to, and you can check out more resources on my website, KStevMath.com. It's up here on the screen, or there is a link in the description as well. And I'm actually doing a whole pre-algebra course using the Math UC curriculum. If you are interested in following along with that, go to my website and check it out, because I'd be happy to have you come along and do that as well. So happy learning, happy mathing. Bye.